Nicole McGurin has her MS in gerontology from the University of Massachusetts in Boston. She has more than 25 years of experience in the field of long-term care and community, assisted living, and nursing home settings. After years of working in the long-term care field and volunteering as a support group volunteer, she joined the Alzheimer's Association as a staff member in 2006. First as the early stage program manager and now as the programs and services director. She enjoys combining her passion for the mission of the Alzheimer's Association and her love of long distance running and hiking by participating in the Run to End Alzheimer's team and the longest day, including Boston Marathon charity runner 3 times. Speaking to us today on understanding Alzheimer's and dementia, please give a warm Brotherhood welcome to Nicole McGurin.
Well, thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you, Stuart, for inviting me, and thank you to everyone who cooked the delicious breakfast. The people at home will be jealous when I come back and tell them what I've had. Again, my name is Nicole McGurin, and I'm the program director of the Alzheimer's Association Massachusetts New Hampshire chapter. My job at the Alzheimer's Association is that I oversee 2 different teams. I oversee a team of social workers who meet with caregivers and people with Alzheimer's one-on-one to provide individual guidance for them. And I also oversee our community engagement and outreach work in Greater Boston and Northeastern Massachusetts. I'm really proud to have worked at the Alzheimer's Association for almost 20 years. This is both a professional passion of mine and a personal passion of mine. I got my interest to start in this field very long ago. When I was in high school, I worked as a nurse's aide in a nursing home. And I worked there throughout high school and in college, and I was really enjoyed my work with the residents there who were living with Alzheimer's and dementia, and I was really inspired how supportive and committed all the family members were to their loved ones who lived in the nursing home that I was at. And I've been fortunate to be able to stay in that field ever since. And the cause is also very personal to me, as I'm sure it is to many of you in the room. Right now, my grandmother and her sister are currently living with dementia. My dad is their primary caregiver. So I see this in my family as well. So before I kick off my presentation, I'm just going to ask for a show of hands. How many of the people in the room either currently know somebody with Alzheimer's or dementia or have had somebody in their circles? Mm-hmm. Just about everybody, which is often the case when we do these presentations. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity today to talk to you. So as you see on this slide, some highlights of our facts and figures. So every year the Alzheimer's Association produces this report called Facts and Figures, which documents the prevalence of Alzheimer's in our society, the cost of the disease to our society, its impact on the workforce, and we also always have a deep dive into some topic related to Alzheimer's and dementia. It's a really important report, and actually if you are in the science world and if you read any study in a journal, you're going to see this report cited for statistics involving Alzheimer's disease. So not surprisingly, in my time at the association, I've seen these numbers grow and grow. And in 2025, this is the first time that we've said over 7 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's disease. I think when I started at the association 19 years ago, we were saying somewhere around 4.5 million. So that number has grown quite a bit. We also know that Alzheimer's is not a disease that just affects the person who has the disease, but it also affects the family. And this number has also increased in the last year. We're now saying that nearly 12 million Americans are providing unpaid care to someone living with Alzheimer's or dementia. And we know that this is a disease that costs an incredible amount to our healthcare system. The current costs for that are $384 billion. And if there are no major advances in science, that cost is looking to increase to $1 trillion in 2050. This year's Facts and Figures report focused on Americans' interest in treatment for Alzheimer's disease. we're going to touch on this in this presentation because this is an area of lots of hope for us at the Alzheimer's Association, and I hope for all of you. And I think not surprisingly, 92% of Americans would want a medication to slow Alzheimer's following a diagnosis. And people are becoming more optimistic about those treatments. So a little bit about the Alzheimer's Association, where I come from. So the Alzheimer's Association is the world's largest voluntary nonprofit organization devoted to Alzheimer's care, support, and research. Our mission is to lead the end to Alzheimer's and all other dementia by accelerating global research, driving risk reduction and early detection, and maximizing quality care and support. I want to just highlight that, although our name is the Alzheimer's Association, that you see on these slides, that you see in all of our materials, but our official name, and the one that I get my paycheck from, is the Alzheimer's Association and Related Disorders Association. And we really are there regardless of the type of dementia. I'm going to dive into that in a little bit. In terms of the support we offer families, the research that we're doing, we really are there regardless of what that diagnosis is. We do have our headquarters for the Alzheimer's Association are located in Chicago and Washington, D.C., and we have 70 chapters across the country. I'm part of the Massachusetts, New Hampshire chapter. Our headquarters are down the road in Newton, Massachusetts, and we also have an office in Worcester and in Bedford, New Hampshire. And we're really proud to be one of the founding members of the Alzheimer's Association, and while we are a little bit small in the chapter in terms of our geographic size, we are one of the leading chapters in our fundraising, in the research grants that are given in this neck of the woods, and have been able to really introduce a lot of innovative programs for families, which we are really proud of. I don't want to forget to neglect this, but I do have some materials up here if you're interested at the end of the program in grabbing. And the other thing I will note too is we are a nonprofit and we're not funded by the government, which these days is a very good thing. So we are able to provide anything we provide to families at no cost to them with no eligibility requirements. We're the largest private nonprofit funder of research worldwide. But that is dependent on people that we work with. We're able to do that. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about Alzheimer's and dementia, those terms, how they're different. We'll talk about early detection and diagnosis. We're going to talk about some of the research and treatment advances. We'll talk about the resources and opportunities with the Alzheimer's Association. And then I'm really looking forward to getting your questions. I'm happy to answer questions about anything related to Alzheimer's, dementia, and brain health. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell you where to get it. But I've had the chance to work in a lot of different areas of our work, and it's always exciting to hear what's on people's minds about their questions. Talking about this difference between Alzheimer's and dementia. This is definitely the most common question that I get. I've gotten in my entire career at the Alzheimer's Association is, what is the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia? And I promise you, I won't give you a quiz about this at the end. And it's okay if it's not clear and you have another question about it at the end. I'm happy to talk about it more. It is confusing. So dementia is an umbrella term for all kinds of cognitive symptoms that can include memory loss. It can include changes in communication, behavior, personality changes, changes to your executive function or your ability to kind of plan your day and manage your time, and do complicated tasks like that, balancing a checkbook or doing work-type functions. And it's experiencing those symptoms to a severe enough degree that it's interfering with your independence and your quality of life. There are many different diseases that cause these dementia symptoms. Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia. It accounts for 60 to 80% of all cases of dementia. There also is vascular dementia, which is a group of types of dementia, all caused by some kind of change in the blood flow to your brain. There's a Lewy body dementia that often involves not just some of those cognitive symptoms, but usually also involves some Parkinson-type symptoms. And there's also a frontotemporal dementia, which is noted by changes in the frontal part of the brain that especially affect one's personality and their ability, that executive function, which is, again, planning and organizing activities. But there are, and I will tell you, there are new subtypes of dementia being introduced all the time. Like I can sometimes be on our helpline, get a call, and someone tells me a name I have never heard of, even though I've worked at the association for a really long time, and I have to look it up. So this is changing all the time as science is emerging. One other way to think about this that I'm stealing from one of my amazing volunteers is that if you're trying to think about what's the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia is ice cream. It's the category. And, Alzheimer's is chocolate, Lewy body is strawberry. So, again, Alzheimer's is the type, and dementia is the broad category. It's also important to note that not all cognitive decline is dementia. Sometimes people experience cognitive decline due to things that are sometimes treatable, like having depression, overuse of alcohol, thyroid imbalances, vitamin imbalances, side effects from medication, depression. Those can all cause cognitive decline. That's not dementia, but if those issues are resolved, people should be able to return to their normal cognitive function. So that's another key thing to keep in mind. We are going to dive a little bit deeper into Alzheimer's disease because it is the most common type of dementia that we see. With an Alzheimer's type dementia, generally the first symptoms that people report are loss of short-term memory, or especially recent recall. That's usually where it starts. It does progressively get worse over time. The range that people live with Alzheimer's disease goes from 4 years after diagnosis to more than 20 years. And I will tell you anecdotally, I've seen that entire range. It is possible to have Alzheimer's disease and another type of dementia at the same time. And unfortunately, at this point, Alzheimer's disease doesn't have a cure. We are going to talk about some emerging treatments, and eventually it is fatal. And eventually, although those symptoms start with things mild, like a short-term memory, eventually people need round-the-clock help with their day-to-day activities. Another thing with Alzheimer's to keep in mind as well is that it is primarily seen in older people over the age of 65, but it is possible to have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's before the age of 65. That accounts for probably about 5% of all cases of dementia are people who are under the age of 65. When Alzheimer's happens before the age of 65, it is the same disease. There's not something different that's happening in the brain. It's really the age that it is happening. And oftentimes, because somebody are at a younger age, the impact of the disease can be different. I do work with people who have we call that kind of dementia either early onset or younger onset dementia. And many of those individuals that I work with, still might have children in school. They might still be working. So the kinds of challenges that come up are especially difficult. So talking a little bit about kind of what happens in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease is the kind of abnormal functioning of two different proteins. Proteins that exist in everybody's brain, but for some reason in people with Alzheimer's disease, these proteins misbehave. And one of those proteins is called beta amyloid. And the beta amyloid protein tends to clump up between the nerve cells in the brain and causes these formations that you see on the slide that we call plaques. And then there's another protein called tau that develops in these tangles inside the nerve cells. And scientists don't yet understand why that causes the symptoms of dementia. And I will tell you, it's definitely the leading theory for what causes dementia, but not every scientist agrees on that. There's still a lot of research looking into this, but these changes are definitely observed. In the beginning, these changes are microscopic, and they can really only be seen, on a PET scan. They can see some evidence of that in cerebral spinal fluid, but they don't see these changes on a CAT scan or a regular MRI. I'll tell you, this is a frequent, call that somebody will say to me is they've started the diagnostic process. And a lot of times they'll start with this CAT scan to make sure someone's symptoms aren't caused by a brain tumor or something they can see on a CAT scan, and people will feel like that's great news, that they didn't see Alzheimer's on the CAT scan. And frankly, sometimes that's more a sign that maybe it is Alzheimer's because they haven't seen something on the CAT scan that explains those symptoms. They can't see it on that kind of imaging yet. But as Alzheimer's progresses, the accumulation of these changes does get to the point where it is visual. And you can see in the final picture on that slide, if you compare a healthy brain with someone with advanced Alzheimer's, you can actually see some real physical differences to the brain. There's a shrinkage, their cavities start to develop in the brain, and the brain actually weighs significantly less than it did when it was a healthy brain. These changes don't happen all over the brain at the same time. They tend to start in the part of the brain that is our brain's filing cabinet or a campus, which is why it's so hard, why that first symptom does tend to be that really recent memory that people have. That's where the damage tends to start. And as the disease progresses, unfortunately, it spreads to other parts of the brain that control other functions that we have. Another thing to keep in mind with these changes is that we now, because of advances in science, we now know that these microscopic changes in the brain, those plaques and tangles that develop, they actually start years before we see any symptoms in the brain. And as those changes accumulate, people generally do start to experience some symptoms. At first, the symptoms are incredibly mild, and we actually call it mild cognitive impairment. A good way to think about it is that, the cognitive decline is more than we would expect with normal aging, and it's different for that particular individual, but it's not severe enough to impact their daily functioning. So somebody in the mild cognitive impairment phase probably could still do their job, they could still drive, things like that. But again, they would notice that I'm having more trouble than I should be having. But as the damage continues and the symptoms get severe, then we would categorize what someone's experiencing as dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. And then generally speaking, the stages of Alzheimer's are mild, moderate, and severe. Nobody goes through these phases exactly the same way, so I can't tell you how many years does one last, how many years does another last. There's a lot of variety. But generally speaking, when symptoms are mild, they're generally around short-term memory loss and word-finding issues more than anything, and probably with more complex functions, possibly what people are doing at their job, things like balancing a checkbook. But in the mild stages, most people can still do things like bathing, dressing, things that they are in their long-term memory. Those kinds of things, remain intact. In the moderate or middle stages, that's when we really start to see some real changes in people's functioning, where people need more support to do things like bathing and dressing. Sometimes we start to see some challenging behaviors come up because people are just having a lot of trouble making sense of what's happening in their environment, and often are having much more trouble with communicating their own needs and understanding what you're telling them. And then in the severe stages of Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately, most people do need help with all of their activities of living, and communication is pretty limited. People still at the later stages of Alzheimer's, they can still respond to things happening around them in most cases, but it might be things like, instead of having a conversation, it would be, listening to music. Maybe it's enjoying going for a walk and looking at what's around. There are ways to interact, but it's going to be you're going to need to modify that quite a bit. So I had this question actually at the table, and this is probably the second most common question that I get from people is whether Alzheimer's disease is hereditary or not. It's not strictly hereditary, but family history does play a part. The greatest risk factors for developing Alzheimer's disease are age. Age is the biggest one. After the age of 65, our risk of developing Alzheimer's disease doubles every 5 years. And by the time people are 85, a third of people have Alzheimer's or another type of dementia. So age is a big factor. Family history is also a factor. But it's not a case of, if my mom had Alzheimer's disease and my dad didn't, I have a 50% chance of getting Alzheimer's. It's not that kind of simple math. A better way to think about it is if my mom had Alzheimer's disease and my friend's parents didn't have any kind of dementia, I have a greater chance of developing Alzheimer's than she does. And the more it is in my family history, the greater that my risk is. The other thing that plays in, we are learning more about how genetics plays in. I mean, clearly when you have a family history thing, there's probably something genetic going on. And scientists have been discovering different genes associated with Alzheimer's disease. They basically fall into two different categories. There is a set of genes that are called deterministic genes. So someone who has one of those genes will develop Alzheimer's and dementia. Those deterministic genes at this point account for less than 1% of all cases of Alzheimer's disease. So it is rare to, at this point, that those genes are quite rare, and they do pertain to that younger onset dementia. But then we also have some genes that indicate that you're susceptible to Alzheimer's disease. One that you hear about the most of is APOE. And when people have a copy of that gene, they have a higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. But it's not, if you have it, it doesn't mean you're getting Alzheimer's disease. So at this point, most of the time, most genetic testing with Alzheimer's disease is done in the course of a research study. And occasionally people will seek genetic testing in other ways, but it's not freely available. It's not something you can test, or something you can order online. So that's one category of those risk factors. And unfortunately, those are things we can't change, even though I'm sure I'll put myself in that category. If I could make myself a little bit younger, I would, but I can't stop aging. We can't change family history, even if there are some things we'd like to change about that. But there are also risk factors that we have some control over, and we are going to talk a little bit more in detail about those later in the presentation. But there's a lot of encouraging science indicating that up to 40% of cases of cognitive decline and dementia could be prevented or delayed by those modifiable risk factors. So lifestyle choices, such as exercise and diet, and also controlling certain health conditions like diabetes and heart disease. So that's a really encouraging part of the story that we're doing today. There are some populations who are at higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, and this is another area of a lot of research. We know that Black older Americans are twice as likely as older white Americans to have Alzheimer's and dementia, and older Hispanics are 1.5 times as likely to have Alzheimer's than white Americans. We also know that almost 2/3 of Americans living with Alzheimer's are women. And some of that is explained by the fact that women live longer than men. And I just told you that age is the greatest risk factor, but it doesn't explain all of that difference. And we also know that women are at higher risk for having Alzheimer's and dementia. They also are the majority of people caring for those with Alzheimer's and dementia. So this is a disease that really strongly affects women in a lot of different ways. It's more important than ever, I think, to understand how Alzheimer's is diagnosed and be aware of those signs and to try to do something about those signs. So that's what we're going to talk about next. So in this slide, you will see the 10 warning signs of Alzheimer's. And this is a list that the Alzheimer's Association has put together of the most common warning signs of Alzheimer's disease. I'll give it a few caveats. This is not a way to diagnose somebody with Alzheimer's disease. It's a way to get a sense of whether I should talk to a doctor about what I'm seeing. It's also not a list that we need to check. If we check off 5, then we talk to the doctor. It really varies from person to person, but it is a list developed to give people an idea of what things to look for. And we'll talk a little bit about these signs, but as you glance at these, you'll see, some of these signs are things that seem like normal aging. So we're going to talk a little bit in this, how that differs from normal aging. Because there is a certain amount of cognitive decline that does happen as we age. I've heard that, starting around age 30, we see some changes in how our cognition works. One of those being, I'm sure we can all have met people in this situation, is our ability to learn new things. If a family comes to this country and they don't speak English and we've got 3 generations, who's going to be the first one to learn English? The kids. Yeah. And they probably won't even have to take a class. They might just go to school and pick it up. It's going to be the hardest for the older people in the family to learn the language. They can learn it, but it's going to take longer. It's probably going to take a class. It's going to take more work to learn the language. We see it with new phones. I mean, I get a new phone and I need to look at the direction manual and figure out how to use it. And I can learn, and I'm pretty good. I think I'm a whiz at using my phone. My kids just open it up and immediately know what to do with it. They just figure it out in 5 minutes. So that is a change. Your brain's not quite as elastic with learning new things as you get older. And then we do have, it is short-term memory is a bit more challenged as we age. But it tends to be, the difference to think about, whether this is something to be worried about versus normal aging, is that if it's normal aging, the problem is in retrieving the information. It has been stored in your brain's filing cabinet, but maybe because you've got so much important stuff in there, it can take a little longer to find it. And it might process a little bit slower. But eventually you can pull it out. It might be, that night before you go to bed. You'll remember where you saw that actor. It just pops into your head. When it's something related to dementia, the problem is in the storage. The information, new information isn't getting in. So when someone's looking for it, they can't pull it out. So it's just not there. So that's kind of a general difference in thinking about those changes. So that's a little bit about the memory loss. And again, the memory loss, if it might be Alzheimer's or dementia, what we tend to see in the beginning is more short-term type memory loss. Sometimes that comes up as seeing somebody who is missing appointments, needing lots and lots of notes to get through the day. We also sometimes see changes in planning and solving problems that can come into play, particularly if someone is still working and seeing a change in their work performance. Sometimes, too, we might even start to see that come into more familiar tasks, like someone who's, having trouble with the laundry machine, and they've used that, for many years, and now they're having sometimes some confusion to time and place in the beginning stages, getting to a room and not being able to figure out how you got there exactly, and having that happen quite a bit. Another one that I think is probably the most unknown on this list is trouble with understanding visual images and spatial relationships, which, it's very common for, as we age, to have changes in our vision, and we're more susceptible to things like cataracts and glaucoma. But with this, it's not a disease of the eye, it's how your brain is interpreting what you see. And a lot of times that comes into place with issues with depth perception, sometimes difficulty seeing things without high contrast. Like someone might look at, I think one of the trickiest ones is, a typical street sign is green and it's got white print on it. And a lot of times for people in the beginning stages, they can't pick out that white print against that green. It can come up with people missing steps, having some changes in their balance. But particularly with some related types of dementia, this visual issue can really be one of the earlier things that we see. Also, we sometimes see issues with word finding, keeping your train of thought, maybe even sometimes people having difficulty reading, when they obviously could read really well earlier in their life. Having trouble with misplacing things and not being able to retrace your steps. I know this is one that people often chuckle a little bit about because we all lose things from time to time. But someone who might have a sense of dementia, they might lose their keys, and then the keys later, they find the keys, let's say they find the keys next to the phone, and they have no idea how they got there. Whereas you or I would see them there and be like, oh yeah, the phone rang when I came in, and I threw the keys down to pick up the phone. That's why we're there. With someone with dementia, they just have no clue how they got there. There's no memory whatsoever. We also sometimes see changes in judgment, which often appears with some changes in someone's hygiene in the beginning stages. Sometimes some withdrawal from work and social activities, so someone who's formerly very outgoing is not wanting to be out as much. And then related to that, sometimes some changes in mood and personality. And again, people generally, in the early stages are not experiencing every single one of these symptoms. And the key thing to keep in mind is what I'm seeing something that is different than someone's usual functioning? And is it severe enough that it's really affecting their quality of life? And if so, it's really important to talk to a doctor about those symptoms. And there's lots of reasons for talking to the doctor about those symptoms. One reason that didn't make this slide is what we talked about in the beginning, which is that not all cognitive decline is Alzheimer's or dementia. Maybe someone's experiencing those changes and their thyroid is out of whack. And you wouldn't know that if you don't go to a doctor and get that treated. So it's really important to do that and make sure that anything that could be treated is treated. And even if it does turn out to be Alzheimer's or a different type of dementia, an early diagnosis provides access to treatments. The current treatments we have are only available to people who have a diagnosis and are in the early stages. It allows people the opportunity to participate in research if they're interested. They can make some lifestyle changes to improve how they're doing. It allows them to do things like make decisions about the future. Who would I like to be my power of attorney? Play a part in those, and possibly do some financial planning that enables them to have more resources for care they might need in the future too. So there's a lot of reasons, I think, to pursue that. And that diagnostic experience is improving all the time. And I started in the field so many years ago, much more than 25 years ago, but it's hard to put longer than that on your bio. People would think that the only way that I can get diagnosed is after death. You can only see, you need to do that through a brain autopsy. And that's no longer the case anymore. But we're still in a place where there's not one test to determine whether someone has Alzheimer's or a different type of dementia. Doctors are using a combination of diagnostic tools combined with medical history to make an accurate diagnosis. It's estimated that if they follow what's recommended, they're more than 90% accurate with their diagnosis. And that includes, doing a physical exam. It usually involves doing some kind of biomarker, either looking at, usually these days it's usually a PET scan or a cerebral spinal fluid or a spinal tap to look for evidence of those plaques and tangles that we talked about. It involves a neurological exam. And it also involves cognitive testing. So really looking at how is someone functioning, how is their memory functioning, and looking at that over time. So it's great that this has improved, but I will say it is, for anyone who has had a loved one who has gone through this diagnostic workup, it takes a long time. And it's costly, it's stressful. And frankly, there's so much demand for this testing right now that even in the Boston area where we've got lots of hospitals and doctors, it's not unusual to talk to a family that's waiting more than 6 months for an initial appointment. So, we really do need to continue to support efforts to improve this diagnosis because it's timely, it's costly, and we really don't currently have enough medical staff to be able to keep up with the demand. That's a great segue into this treatment and opportunities that we have right now. And this is an area of lots of hope for us at the Alzheimer's Association. In 2024, there were 164 clinical trials registered looking at Alzheimer's and other dementia. These clinical trials are looking at a variety of different targets that could be causing the dementia symptoms we're seeing. Some of them are looking at the amyloid and the tau that we talked about. Some are looking at inflammation. There's all kinds of avenues they're looking at attacking this disease. There's lots of research that's around improving cognition. There's clinical trials around medications to manage the behavioral symptoms of Alzheimer's and dementia. And also, again, a lot of risk reduction research that is happening as well. So in the area of treatments, again, unfortunately, we still are in an era where we don't have a cure for Alzheimer's disease, but we are seeing new treatments emerge to help. And right now, in the last 2 years, what's exciting is we have seen the first 2 medications that actually attack the biology, what we think is the biology of Alzheimer's disease, to slow down the disease. So we've had 2 drugs, lecanemab and Sunra. Those are their trade names, or sometimes you hear them referred to as lecanemab and donanemab, but that have been approved by the FDA that actually slow the progression of Alzheimer's and dementia. We also have for many years had some drugs to treat the cognitive symptoms of Alzheimer's and dementia as well, things like Aricept and Namenda. And we've also seen some medications emerge to treat behavioral symptoms of Alzheimer's and dementia. I will say these drug treatments, they don't work for everybody. A lot of them have need to be in a specific stage to be able to be appropriate for them, but we're definitely seeing some progress in that area. And in this slide, I think I included this. It's got a lot of fancy names on it, but I do like that it really does, I think, show where we're going with Alzheimer's and dementia. Alzheimer's actually, we didn't talk about this in the beginning, but it was discovered long ago in 1906 by Dr. Alzheimer. And it did take until, almost 100 years later did we see the first drugs to help treat Alzheimer's and dementia. And the first one we saw was Aricept, and then through the years, some other medications emerged to treat those cognitive symptoms. The drugs kind of in that first category there, the Aricept, the Exelon, the Razidine, and the Namenda, those drugs did not do anything about the plaques and tangles in the brain, but they do increase certain chemicals in the brain that are kind of lacking in people with Alzheimer's to help their brain function better. So they basically help the brain compensate for the damage that's happening. Unfortunately, over time, the damage gets worse and they're not as effective. But that was the first grouping of drugs that we started to see for Alzheimer's disease. And then we've seen two other categories of drugs start to emerge. And one, which is really promising, I think, for people who are currently living with Alzheimer's, maybe in the later stages, are looking at some drugs that treat some of the behavioral symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. As this disease progresses, a lot of families do deal with some pretty challenging behaviors, sometimes agitation, aggression, sleep issues. There are medications to treat those things, but most of those medications actually have black box warnings not to use for people with dementia. And I'm sure if you've listened closely to commercials that you hear about these, you often hear increased risk of death for people with dementia. That's often when you hear a TV ad for medications to treat these kinds of things. So that's been, and a lot of times, doctors will use those drugs because they've tried everything they can and they monitor it closely. But it's exciting to see that some of these drugs are starting to be, they've figured out how to make them safe for people with dementia. So two of those drugs are Belsomra and Rexulti that help with some of the agitation sleeping issues, and there are more drugs that are looking to attack some of those behavioral symptoms in the pipeline too. And then again, we've seen the other two drugs that we've seen are Leqembi and Sunla that actually do reduce the amount of beta amyloid in the brains of people with dementia. And in studies, that's shown to slow the progression of the disease. And these drugs are beginning to be available. There are actually quite a few in this area places that people can access these drugs. Unfortunately, right now, they are drugs that need to be given in an infusion. It's expensive, and finding places to do that, it is tricky. But it does look like in the next year or so, hopefully they will be available by an injection. And then, of course, ultimately the hope is that it can be available in a pill form as well. But it's exciting to see that. And I work with people all the time who are taking these treatments and feel really optimistic about that. The other area we've seen some advances in are in biomarkers or the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. People are very hopeful around improvements in multiple and different biomarkers that will, again, make that diagnosis less timely, less costly, less invasive for people. So we did have a blood test approved in the last, I think, year and a half or so for Alzheimer's disease, and they are using that blood test in research now. It's not yet approved to be used in a regular doctor's office, wasn't studied in a broad enough population yet, but that is coming. It's unlikely that blood test is going to replace the other testing yet. It will be a part of the diagnostic process. But as that becomes more fine-tuned, hopefully we will be able to reduce having to use PET scans for diagnosis. It's not happening in the near future, but again, as it advances, that is the goal. The final area of research I'd like to touch on is around this risk reduction and a little bit more detail in that area. Again, up to 40% of dementia cases could be prevented or delayed by targeting these modifiable risk factors. Most research says that you get a better bang when you combine multiple healthy habits, and also show that it doesn't matter when you start these healthy habits, you can still see an improvement in your risk for Alzheimer's and dementia. And on this slide, you'll see the 10 healthy habits. And the Alzheimer's Association published this about 2 years ago. They looked at all the research happening around brain health and risk reduction and picked the 10 areas that have the strongest science behind them. And I did say there's a lot of science happening about this now. So I would guess this list may change in a year, depending on how the research pans out. But for right now, these 10 areas are the areas that have the most science behind them. And that includes protecting your head, so doing things to reduce your risk of head injury, particularly wearing helmets with sports, and doing things to reduce your risk of falls. Especially in older people, falls are the greatest risk factor for head injury. So that's really important. There are a lot of things we can do to reduce that. And if you get a head injury, take care of it. Go see the doctor, do what they tell you to do. Being smoke-free is another one, and research does show, like with many things, if you quit smoking, you can reduce your risk to that of a non-smoker by quitting smoking. 3 health conditions in particular are important to keep an eye on. One is keeping your blood sugar in check, keeping your weight in check, and controlling your blood pressure. Physical exercise is also important. There's not one specific exercise that's been recommended, but it does seem like something that at least gets your heart rate increased is important. Eating a healthy diet, and generally speaking, that's a heart-healthy diet, a Mediterranean diet, a diet that has a limited amount of processed foods, is the healthiest for your brain. And then the other areas are around keeping your brain active. That is so important that it gets 2 healthy habits on there. And one is staying in school, continuing to receive some kind of formal education. And I would say you guys can check one off the list because you come to this breakfast and you get a lecture on a topic at least once a month. And I'm guessing you probably do more of that than just this because most people don't just do this once a month. But that is important to continue to engage in formal learning. And then the other one is continuing to challenge your mind. That's not as simple as doing crossword puzzles. I wish it was because I love them. But it is doing things that really do develop some new pathways in your brain. So I would say if the crossword puzzle is really hard for you and you have to do some research around it and think through, then you're challenging your brain. If you get to the point that my grandmother was at with crossword puzzles, where she could just do it in 10 minutes and go through it, it's no longer working for that. That's no longer a healthy habit anymore. It's still good, but it's not challenging your brain. So it could be reading a book about a topic you don't know about, trying to learn a language, learn an instrument. One of the things I like to do, one of my hobbies is knitting, and I like to challenge myself with harder patterns all the time that I know I'm not going to do so well on at first, but need to figure out. So things like that are really important. We're not at the point yet. These are general instructions, so we can't tell people this is the brain exercise that works, or this is the specific diet you should be eating, but we're getting closer to that. Just this past summer, the Alzheimer's Association released results from the U.S. Pointer study. This was a multi-year study that we did in the United States that looked at lifestyle factors and your risk for cognitive decline. And we recruited for 2 groups, and both groups were given information about physical exercise. They were given a specific exercise routine that was recommended to follow. They had regular health monitoring of that weight, blood pressure, blood sugar. They had diet recommendations. They had a specific diet, the MIND diet, that they recommended and taught people about. And they also had a brain program that they did. And they had 2 groups of people, one group that just got the information and they were kind of left to their own devices, and then another group that was kind of part of a structured learning. They met once a month with a group. They got continued encouragement to do these things and that peer support. And they found over the course of the study, both groups have a reduction in cognitive decline. They were functioning significantly better than they were expected to function at that time in that time passage. But the people in the structured group had even more positive benefit, which I don't think surprises any of us that would be helpful. What's exciting about this study is that right now we just have the general recommendations. So that doing these things together reduced cognitive decline. But there's a lot of data in this study. So they're going to be able to take a deep dive into that brain exercise program. And maybe that really was great and it had a benefit, and we'll be able to give it to tell people to use it. We're not quite at that point yet. And the diet too. Right now we just have the general information. But the hope is that research from this study and others will be able to have more of a specific brain health recipe in the coming years. So just to finish up, I want to make sure you know about what we offer to people living with Alzheimer's, family members, and some opportunities to be involved with us. At the heart of what we offer families is our 24/7 helpline. It's available, as the name suggests, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in more than 200 languages. It's an amazing service. I urge you to give it a try. If I don't get to one of your questions today or you think of it later, call them and ask them. They can answer questions. They can provide guidance on caregiving challenges. They can just offer emotional support if someone's having a tough day. They can also answer questions about research you might see in the paper. They can point you to a local program in your community. We also have lots of free education programs and support groups as well. Education programs, we have one that takes a deep dive into brain health. That's really popular. We have a program about the 10 warning signs, and we also have a great series for caregivers that include things like behavior management, communication skills, safety, all kinds of key things that we offer both in person in the community, and we also offer them online as well. And then we also have a service called Trial Match that helps people to find clinical trials that they're interested in. We also are excited that we just introduced a new app that's geared towards people in the early stage of Alzheimer's and caregivers. It's free. It's available for Apple and Android, and it helps people to make plans for the future, connects them with videos, with tips from people living with Alzheimer's disease, and connects people to programs. At the New England chapter, we have a great podcast. I urge you to check it out if you're a podcast person. We release it twice a month. They're usually 20 to 25 minutes on all different topics related to Alzheimer's and dementia with different experts. We have a lot of researchers on the program. We have caregivers on the program. It's really a wonderful podcast. And then we also have a lot of events throughout the year to raise awareness of Alzheimer's and funds for our cause. We just finished up our Walk to End Alzheimer's, which is the world's largest fundraising event, and I'm really proud to say that right now, currently, the Greater Boston Walk is at number 2 in the country. We actually exceeded our goal before Walk Day, and we are climbing towards raising $1.7 million at the Greater Boston Walk this year, which is really exciting. But that really does help support things right here. We're very proud of that. We also have a do-it-yourself fundraiser where people will do car washes. Senior centers might do some kind of mahjong day or something like that to raise funds for Alzheimer's called Do What You Love. We have a bike ride we're in New Hampshire that raises money specifically for research. We have a gala in Boston that's really focused on the business community. That's also a $1 million+ event. It's at the top gala event in the country as well. And then we are also really involved in advancing policy that impacts research funding and services for caregivers through the Alzheimer's Impact Movement, which is our sister nonprofit agency that recruits advocates and lobbies for positive change for Alzheimer's and dementia. So we do have, I didn't include this slide, but I told Stuart I would mention this, but we do have the opportunity for volunteering at the Alzheimer's Association. So we are a small but mighty chapter. We have 40 employees across Massachusetts and New Hampshire, but we reach lots of people and have lots of successful events, but we couldn't do it without volunteers. So we use volunteers in all the events we have, both in planning them and the day of events. I also use lots of volunteers to lead support groups, to teach education programs, to help me at health fairs so that we can really get out there in the community more than me and my team and I cannot meet all the demand that we have for information. And we also use volunteers, again, with public policy. We have our advocates tell their personal stories, and it really makes a difference when we're trying to get certain bills passed. And we have a really exciting bill this year in Massachusetts that we're working on. That one key part of this bill, which we're super excited about, is requiring dementia training for first responders who are often called in these situations. So we're hoping that gets passed and that will really make a positive difference for the constituents we work with. So at that point, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Hi, thank you very much for your lecture. I think it was wonderful. I'm very skeptical about all these drugs that I see advertised, these over-the-counter brain supplements. Do they do anything?
So none of these drugs that you see are drugs, natural supplements for, improving memory, reducing the risk of Alzheimer's disease. They're not approved by the FDA. There are no studies to show that they are effective. And the World Health Organization and the Alzheimer's Association are not behind any of those treatments that you see that are not approved by the FDA. I will say to people, though, it is really important if you, I know some people are just very into natural supplements. It doesn't matter what I say, they're still going to do that. If you're doing that, talk to your doctor about them. Make sure he or she knows that you're taking them, because they can, even though they're natural, they might interact with other health conditions you have or medications that you are taking. So it's really important that you don't just kind of come up with your own prescription regime on these things.
This really was an excellent presentation. You speak really well. I just still have one question though. Hate to use these initials, but has AI worked its way into the researchers yet?
That's a good question. I'm not. I'm not sure. I haven't read anything about that. I will say, I'll just talk about in our work. I will say AI has been helpful for us in some of our work on our helpline in terms of just speeding up the time it takes for documentation, which allows us to talk to more people. And actually, with some of the paperwork end of things, we might be funding something around AI. I'm just not aware of all of that. But we are seeing new technologies emerge all the time for managing Alzheimer's and dementia, whether that's, not surprising, GPS and different kinds of bracelets and things to help with wandering. So those things are emerging all the time.
Thank you. I was going to relate, related to that. Yes, in fact, AI is being instrumental in an area which I'm involved in, which is hyper accelerated drug discovery. I'm working with a company right now that is developing hyper accelerated drug discovery techniques, and their first 2 screenings will be Alzheimer related. So there is a huge attention being paid to that and developing medications toward that using AI and massive amounts of data.
I don't find that surprising, and yes, it's funny. I was just it just came up. I was listening to the Rick Ski's podcast on the way here, challenging my brain, and that was one of the things we were talking about was AI and travel planning. not as important as what we're talking about today, but more fun.
Thank you for your wonderful conversation. My mother died of Alzheimer's or related issues. She was in her late 70s when she was diagnosed. You mentioned family history. There's no family history. This was a shock and a surprise to all of us when she was diagnosed, and at the end it was the worst. She didn't know us. So I wonder, is this going to happen to me? Sure, I'm at the age where I figure out where I put my keys, but then I can find them, or whatever. But how do I know? How do I know? Or do I not know?
I don't think any of us know for sure. Just like with all kinds of diseases that we might have in our family history, we're not sure if we're going to get them or not. But we do know, they are things. For instance, my dad has type 2 diabetes. I may not get it, but I am at increased risk for developing that with that family history. So I monitor that and I keep an eye on that and I'm aware of it. So I think it's one of those things to be aware of, to definitely to monitor it. The other thing I want to mention too that you brought up, and I appreciate you sharing your mom's story. And this is such a, this disease has such a broad impact on our community, on our families, and it's for many people. I'm not going to say all diseases are tough, definitely, but Alzheimer's in particular, it can be a really long time that someone's supporting somebody, and that really that just seems, I think it exacerbates the toll. The other thing I just want to highlight of what you said about the risk factor is that, again, family history increases our risk for developing Alzheimer's and dementia. But it doesn't mean if you don't have a family history, you're safe. You have less risk, but you could still, develop Alzheimer's and dementia. Even that younger onset dementia that's talked about, that's a common stereotype that I hear people say this all the time, even in the field. Younger onset dementia is always genetic, and it sometimes is genetic, but it also can be sporadic. I meet families who there's no history whatsoever of Alzheimer's and dementia in young people or older people, and unfortunately someone ends up getting it before the age of 65. So it can happen sporadically as well. But I think it's important to, yes, be aware of those warning signs and be on top of it. I think we should all care about brain health as long as we have a brain, particularly if we know that's in our family history, to pay attention to those things like smoking, diet, blood sugar, all those things that, can increase your risk for developing dementia.
Thank you again for coming. Dealing with this on a personal level, just not my question, but I noticed my loved one is in a facility, and I noticed how many husbands and wives are both having dementia in the facility. It's not like husband visits wife or wife visits husband. There were several husbands and wives, different families coming together, and they both had dementia, which is ironic. The question I have, though, is in the older person, as you say, who does get dementia and has a possible propensity of having the two proteins. And one of the things I've done on my own surgeries is that surgery exacerbates the increase of dementia. And the one I'm dealing with was my wife. She had two back surgeries. And it was after that she came out with real dementia. And I sat down with the surgeon and I asked the surgeon, could the surgery have exacerbated dementia? And he said, anesthesia in older people who have a propensity to it could get the dementia. And it's almost like I said today, I know it's very expensive, anybody over the age of, pick an age, 55, who's going to have any significant surgery with anesthesia should be tested, either with a blood test or a scan, to see if they do have it before they do have the surgery, so they can make options. And that's something I've been reading about for anesthesia. Long-term anesthesia exacerbates the dementia. I don't know if you have any facts.
Well, I would say there's a lot of research looking at anesthesia and Alzheimer's risk and worsening risk that's being done. There's been also a lot of work to formalize the protocol for anesthesia in older people at higher risk for Alzheimer's and dementia to decrease the likelihood of the side effects that you're talking about. So it's a really key area of research. There's a lot of I want to say niche areas of research because a lot of people are affected by that surgery. But another area that there's a lot of research around is between the connection between PTSD and head injury with veterans and the risk of Alzheimer's and dementia too. There's definitely some areas of, people because of different things they're experiencing or have in their life that seem to increase that risk. And there's a lot of exciting research happening.
I just want to say thanks for the good work you're doing with all the research at Alzheimer's Association. I work in the biotech and pharmaceutical industry, and I work with a lot of companies who are exploring these products or have products on the market that treat that. And one of the things that I noted you had is all the research you're tracking and how many new products are in the pipeline, et cetera. One consideration, and this is true for academia as well as commercial industry, is there's not a really good database out there of trials that have not worked, drugs that have not worked, and just tracking those and the pharmacokinetics of why they didn't work might help speed up drug trials as well, because that database does not really exist. Companies don't want to call each other up and ask. But, Alzheimer's Association might be uniquely positioned. You could talk to the chief medical officers, CEOs, and say, hey, we're putting this together to speed up research. Will you participate? And you might get a lot more compliance than somebody else at a company.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in this area of our work at the association, but we do have a couple of databases. We have one called AllsNet, and there is a lot of work being done to bring that research and those results together of like you said, studies that have worked and studies that have not worked, and that continues because the idea being that will increase the pace of research if we can reduce some of that competitiveness and have people work together and share what they're learning from both their successes and their failures too. I agree.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive presentation. I have a very simple question. What's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer?
Sure. So let's review that difference between Alzheimer's and dementia. So dementia is an umbrella term, or I often think of it as a category of brain diseases that cause cognitive decline, things like memory loss, behavior changes, trouble with doing, day-to-day functioning that are severe enough to impact your day-to-day life and your independence. So dementia is the big umbrella term. And then Alzheimer's, Lewy body, vascular, those are all types of dementia. So dementia is way up here, Alzheimer's is under it, Lewy body is under that, vascular dementia is under it. So it really is, it's the category of diseases. And Alzheimer's is the specific. I will say, sometimes, and in my presentations, a lot of times I will tell, and I'll give people the heads up, I will often keep saying dementia, and I kind of use it as an inclusive term, because in all my presentations, I said Alzheimer's and related disorders every single time. You would add 10 minutes to my presentation. And I also want to make sure that people realize I'm not just talking about Alzheimer's disease.
Let's thank Nicole once again.
Well, thank you so much for being such an attentive audience. It's great to be able to talk to so many people at the same time.